So the next two presentations by John and Adam are by the co-authors of the figure that both David and I showed earlier as we were talking about kind of the individual embedded in these groups and larger social context. And actually I think in this last session there will be a handful of attempts to really to tie together a fairly complex set of individual, social, psychological, demographic, political constructs into a coherent, easily understood whole. And then we will end this series of presentations with some reflections by Jeff Cohen to orient. So that should be very stimulating. But we're going to start with John Schuldt, all the way here from Italy, maybe the second furthest traveler.
Yeah.
So welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, I'm John Schuldt. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Communication at Cornell. I'm going to be talking about some work with Adam Pearson, who is of course here. I should say that it's been a great delight to collaborate with Adam, especially recently on the environmental work that we do, because Adam and I are old friends. We met as undergrads at Cornell. We used to talk about, we'd take Tom Gilovich's social psych class and we'd say, maybe we could become professors someday. Wouldn't that be like awesome? And so it's fun. It's fun to fast forward. Here we are. Anything you like about this talk, that's Adam's credit. The bad stuff is, of course, on me. So we're going to take a little bit of a new look at the political divide to sort of harken back to some of the talks we saw earlier today. And in particular, we're going to explore in some data the role of race, ethnicity, and social class, some nonpartisan identities, to see to what extent these might matter, perhaps just as much, if not more, than partisan politics that we hear so much about when it comes to climate change beliefs. It's no surprise to anybody in this room, of course, that climate change beliefs get a lot of attention. The literature is expanding. Researchers, policymakers are interested in figuring out the factors that predict the public's beliefs about climate change. And in order to try to get a handle on this rapidly expanding body of evidence, Matt Hornsey and his colleagues recently conducted a meta-analysis that some of you might have seen. And some of the takeaways from that work suggest that things like ideologies, worldviews, values orientations, political orientations seem to dominate usual suspect socio-demographic variables like education, knowledge, and gender. In particular, political affiliation and political ideology. This is across 50 countries, 170 academic studies, 24 political polls. Political affiliation and ideology emerge as the largest predictors of individuals' climate change beliefs. And that's evidence from across the world, across 50 countries. What about in the United States, right? We hear so much about the political divide in the United States context. These data come from about 15 years of polling done by Gallup. They've asked these questions again and again in their surveys over time. And a couple of things jump out. The first is that the American public, since the early 2000s up to about now, is growing more convinced and concerned about global warming overall. Okay, so we might say that's a good thing. For example, clear majorities say that global warming's effects are already happening, that it's caused by humans, and that scientists believe that it's happening. Smaller numbers report worrying a great deal about global warming, or think global warming will pose a serious threat in their lifetimes. But of course, these overall statistics, right, belie some pretty substantial partisan differences that we're all very familiar with, I think, by this point. Taking a closer look at these same Gallup data, Riley Dunlap and his colleagues have pointed out that while the public overall, that's the gray line in the middle, has expressed stronger beliefs that global warming's effects are already happening, over that same time period, so too has the partisan gap grown larger, okay? And so this particular belief here is, like I said, the belief that global warming's effects are already happening. But you find a familiar pattern, a similar pattern, if you look at other items in Gallup's database. So for example, the thought that global warming will pose a serious threat in your lifetime. So Democrats have grown more convinced and concerned, Republicans have grown less so. And so the big question is why, right? So folks are wondering, okay, what could explain this? And there's lots of social theories. People have pointed to things like motivated reasoning, or even Dan Kahan's cultural cognition theory of risk, this idea that we have preformed attitudes, values, sort of beliefs about how society should be structured, and we sort of interpret climate change information through those lenses, right? And we see the world how we're sort of predisposed to see it. There's also things like the elite Q hypothesis, right, that comes out of political science, that what we might be seeing here is that individuals sort of are reporting to pollsters the opinions that they know signal their standing in meaningful groups that they belong to, political groups. And so we wondered, okay, politics does seem to matter, like in data sets like these time and time again. But we began asking the question, well, does partisanship, does national level party politics, does that matter equally for everybody in US society? And when we started thinking about that, we started thinking about the research that has been done on disadvantaged groups and environmental issues. And some of that work suggests, when you look at polling, that racial and ethnic minorities in the United States often express stronger environmental concerns and greater policy support than do their white counterparts. And in seeking to explain this pattern, Paul Mohai and other researchers have suggested, well, maybe this is rooted in an awareness of minorities, their group's differential vulnerabilities to environmental impacts, right? I mean, after all, we know that minorities in the United States are more exposed to air pollution, and they're more exposed to industrial pollution. Now, at the same time, some of you might be familiar with a different perspective, but it's complementary in a way, known as the white male effect in risk perception. And this literature focuses on the peculiar stance of white males in US society, many being conservative. And what that research shows is that white males tend to estimate all kinds of risks as being less as compared to women and racial and ethnic minorities in survey data. And so from this, we thought, well, okay, if it is the case that disadvantaged groups might be particularly aware of their group's differential vulnerabilities to climate impacts, well, then maybe when they're asked about their climate change beliefs, what comes to their mind is not their national level party politics affiliations, but instead, perhaps they're more attuned to their racial and ethnic minority in-groups and those concerns. Maybe that is what's driving their beliefs a little bit more than national level party politics. And so to explore this possibility that politics, at least on the national level, might matter less for some people than others, what we did is we took a look at a survey that we had conducted of over 2,000 US adults. This was run for us by GFK Knowledge Network. Some of you will be familiar with them. This is a nationally representative survey. It's a probability-based sample. We had this fielded in 2012. This is conducted on the web, and people complete periodic surveys in exchange for cash equivalent incentive points. It was a large survey, and it was a fairly diverse survey. And so 75% approximately of our respondents identified as white. About 24% identified as something other than white. And so when we took a look at different racial and ethnic memberships, what we saw in the data was we didn't see significant differences across the climate change beliefs that we were interested in. So we did, for the purposes of analysis, we collapsed that, mostly for purposes of statistical power, but also following some methods people have used in prior literature. Importantly, what we had on the survey were three important climate beliefs that have been polled in many other surveys. The first is the individual respondent's belief that climate change is actually happening. This was on a 1 to 7 response scale, from it's definitely not happening to it definitely is happening. We also asked for their belief in the scientific consensus. Essentially, I think scientists do believe it's happening, I think scientists don't believe it's happening, or I think scientists are unsure. Okay, so it was a 3 response scale. Finally, we also asked an item to gauge people's support for climate change policy. Essentially, do you think the United States should or should not regulate regulate carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas? So those are our three main dependent variables. I want to note that we had a couple other important variables in the data set. So these mostly come from GFK's standard demographic profile. First was political ideology, from very liberal to very conservative. We also had party affiliation, so this is Democrat, Republican, Independent, or other. We also had whether or not the individual respondent self-identifies as an environmentalist. Yes, definitely, yes, somewhat, or no. And we collapsed into yes or no for the purposes of the analysis. Let me also say that the results I'm going to present mostly focus on political ideology. If we focus on political affiliation instead, we see the same general pattern emerge. Finally, I mentioned that this is a national survey experiment. So we had one experimental treatment, and what we did is we randomly assigned our respondents to a version of the questionnaire that was either worded in terms of climate change or in terms of global warming. And the reason we did that is based on some of our prior work suggesting that if you simply word a questionnaire in terms of climate change instead of global warming, you see about a 30 to 40% reduction in the partisan divide on personal existence beliefs. What's interesting about that is that we tend to talk, right, in terms of climate change, but when you still look at national opinion polling on the issue, it's often the case that the questions are worded in terms of global warming. So we wanted to see if that effect would replicate, but we also wanted to see if the beliefs of some people, right, in our sample would be more robust to this changing of the label than other people. Okay, so now turning to the results. Our main analysis centered on a series of regression models in which we regressed each one of those three climate change beliefs I talked about onto this model. The first predictor was race ethnicity, coded as white versus non-white. Political ideology, ordered such that conservative is higher, and their interaction term. We were particularly interested in the interaction term, of course. And we control for education, household income, gender. So the first thing I want you to notice is that that interaction between race and ethnicity and ideology is significant in each model, suggesting that political ideology is differentially predicting the climate beliefs, every climate belief in the survey, for whites versus non-whites. Okay, so what's the nature of that interaction? What does it actually look like? So let's take model one, the personal existence belief. And so if we plot personal existence beliefs on a 1 to 7 scale, increasing belief at the top, by political ideology, increasing conservatism, what we see for both whites and non-whites is that the familiar pattern emerges, right? People who self-identify as more conservative report lower levels of belief, personal belief, in climate change or global warming. But it's a significant moderation pattern such that that's especially true for whites. Right? When we look at non-whites in our sample, the relationship is still there, but it's significantly moderated. Both simple slopes are significant, right? But the interaction pattern is there. I'll point out that when we look at the other two variables I talked about, perceptions of the scientific consensus and support for mitigation policy, we see the exact same pattern. Political ideology is a stronger predictor for those beliefs among whites as compared to non-whites in our sample. Now let's take a look at what predicts support for mitigation. So we ran some mediation models that we're depicting here, in which we were particularly interested in the predictive value of political conservatism, identification as an environmentalist, that we were interested in that, and also belief in the scientific consensus, which many of you will know has been garnering a lot of attention in the literature recently as a gateway belief that predicts individuals' personal beliefs in sort of the climate change public opinion space. This is work by Sander van der Linden, his colleague Stephen Lewandowski, and others. And so first we asked, okay, what's happening with belief in the scientific consensus? Is it the gateway belief that people suggest that it is? And what we see here, highlighted in blue, is that belief in a scientific consensus is indeed a strong predictor of personal existence beliefs and support for mitigation, with mediation happening for both whites and non-whites alike. Okay, so that seems to be evidence, right, that complements the gateway model. But we do see some interesting differences across these groups, particularly when we look at political ideology, conservatism, and identification as an environmentalist, predicting personal existence beliefs and support for mitigation. And what we see there, as indicated by the red, is that those things are stronger predictors among whites than they are among non-whites. And in fact, I don't know how well you can see these path coefficients, but the effect sizes are about twice as large among whites as compared to non-whites. And I should say that these models control for all other paths in the models. Finally, I mentioned that we did have this experimental variable, whether we referred to the issue as global warming or climate change in the survey. And what we see there is that the experimental effect that we've seen in independent data sets emerges again, but only among whites. When we look at the effect among non-whites, it's not there. So whites are more doubtful of global warming as compared to climate change, but non-whites in our sample are reporting fairly high levels of belief regardless of what you call it. And that's personal existence belief. Okay. Now, you'll remember that I talked at the beginning about how the patterns of polarization on climate change has been examined over the course of about a 10-year period, right, from early 2000s to the 2010s. And so we got interested in whether or not that increasing polarization that other people had pointed out might itself vary across groups, across majority and minority groups in society. And so when we were interested in this, we thought, well, let's go ahead and dig up some data. We don't always have to collect our own data, right? And doing surveys, that's the beauty, right? We can do secondary analysis. So we got a hold of the General Social Survey from the NORC, and we looked through the questions they asked, and we found that in 2000 and in 2010, they asked a question that we thought was a pretty good proxy for global warming risk perceptions. And the question was about perceived seriousness of rising temperatures. In general, do you think a rise in the world's temperature is extremely dangerous for the environment, very dangerous, somewhat dangerous, not very dangerous, or not at all dangerous? And we analyzed the percentage who said it's extremely or very dangerous by political party affiliation, crossed with race and ethnicity, and then also crossed with SES variables. And I'll break those down for you now. So the question is, who becomes more polarized over a 10-year period? The panel on the left are the beliefs in 2000 as measured by the General Social Survey, and the panel on the right is 10 years later in 2010. And what you see is whites are polarized in 2000, but they polarize more by 2010. But we don't see that pattern emerging for non-whites in the General Social Survey. And it's kind of interesting. It seems like white Democrats, their beliefs are strengthening, and white Republicans, their beliefs are going down a little bit. So it does seem like it's sort of equal polarization on both parties. Okay, let's look at so SES. Let's look at social class 2. So here what I'm showing you is perceived seriousness by party again, but this time crossed with income, 2000, 2010. We see the similar pattern emerge once again. Upper income, this is the top quintile, lower income is the bottom quintile. Democrats and Republicans disagree. They disagree even more in 2010. But we don't see the same pattern happening among lower income Americans. When we make the graph for education, we see a similar pattern as income. And so taken together, these data suggest that national level party politics may be a stronger cue for the climate change beliefs of some groups in society, majority groups, but less so for racial and ethnic minority groups in the US. And we think this may have implications for how we understand the factors that promote and hinder engagement on climate change across groups, particularly as the United States grows more diverse. I mean, after all, right, we know that we're experiencing a time of dramatic demographic shifts in this country. The United States is scheduled to be a minority-majority country by as early as 2040. That's true for the under 18 age population just a few years from now, and it's true at birth right now, right, if you look at births in the United States. And so if minority and low-income groups are relying less on these national level political cues, what might they be relying on instead when it comes to sort of formulating and reporting their climate change beliefs? And so we've speculated that if individuals are aware of their group's heightened vulnerabilities to climate change impacts, then it makes sense that they may be more attentive to social cues about the beliefs and the behaviors of those more meaningful, perhaps in groups, more tuned into those signals. And I think you'll be hearing more about that shortly in Adam's talk. But in terms of the bigger picture, I think other people have pointed this out as well. I think there might be a bias that comes from over-attending to the role of politics as an explanatory variable for climate change beliefs. Politics matters without a doubt, but if we perhaps over-focus on politics, I think we gloss over significant nuance. The question of for whom does politics matter? And we might sort of blind ourselves to new exciting opportunities for bolstering environmental engagement among groups who have traditionally been marginalized when it comes to these matters. So let me end by thanking Tess and the Roper Center at Cornell for access to data, and also the Atkinson Center at Cornell and the Environmental Defense Fund for financial support. And thanks to all of you.
It's a fascinating talk and something that we've been having a lot of conversations about. So if you put both interactions in together, are they independent interactions? Did you look at, like in your knowledge networks
Right.
sample? Did you? I know you had SES in there, but did you also have the SES by ideology interaction?
So yeah, so the interactions that we showed from our data from the GFK sample, that interaction seems to be over and above the covariance that we had in the model. So we did have the SES covariance, but I understand what you're asking. If we put both interactions simultaneously into the model, does it soak up all
basically is the race difference, race by ideology difference, driven by the SES by ideology difference, or are they independent?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We didn't run that for the GSS data, and I can't remember if we ran it in our own data.
We have to look at them, we do it.
I don't want to speak to exactly what the model showed when they were both in there at the same time. But I think that's a great question, and it's also kind of a practical question, though. One wonders, right? To the extent that these are overlapping,
I mean,
variables, they might not be.
Yeah, we find that it's when we try to run studies, for example, on campus, it's really difficult to unconfound those variables, you know, and so they are.
Have a really large N.
It's tough, unless you have a really, really large N. In our GFK sample, we have 2,000. We might be powered enough to do it, right? Most one-shot national survey samples don't have that kind of N, especially with a probability sample. So we'll dig into that. And I totally agree. That's a great, really important question to address. Yeah.
Did you look at women versus men when you did this?
We didn't look at gender, but we can. We just haven't.
I mean, it seems like that's like the white men thing.
I know.
Seems like you should.
It's funny that you asked me about it right now, actually, because when I was sitting here getting ready to come up, I had that question pop into my mind too. And I think it's because I've been seeing talks about gender. I'm like, you know what? That's an excellent way to slice the data. We just haven't sliced it that way yet. But once again, we could do it, right? We have it in our own sample, but the GSS is such a rich data set as well, and the appearance of that perceived seriousness about global warming question, again and again over the years, it's such a rich.
Well, and I think there have been some studies that say women do care more.
Oh, absolutely.
But I mean, you could do your own data and see like how do you tease it apart more.
Yeah. No, that's a great thing. We should absolutely look into it in our data. Yeah. Sure. There's a lot of hands.
I just kind of was curious about your opinion on something. When you were talking about like how minorities, like there's less of a difference between the like political parties. Do you think that there may be anything involved in terms of like association of in-groups salience? Like minority groups tend to associate more with the fact that they're a minority as opposed to like white people could be considered like the norm, I guess. Forgive me if I'm like saying anything incorrectly, but and maybe they are more like the political party is more salient to create a form of like identity.
Yeah, I mean, I would be like wildly speculating, but so I don't want to speculate too far beyond the data. But it does remind me of a conversation that Jeff and I were having this morning about just sort of like if it's possible, it seems perhaps that if you're a racial ethnic minority, right, you have a lot more, maybe richer sort of group affiliations and identities, right, that might be on your mind. And those are sort of maybe competing for influence when you're asked about relevant issues, right? And for other people, that may be less so. We don't have any direct sort of psychological mechanism data on that, but I think that's like fascinating to figure out sort of what's underlying the hood here in terms of identity and affiliations. Yeah.
Great, thank
Yeah,
you very
thanks.
much.